Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Tom Farah, who is Dean of the Graduate School of International Studies at the University of Denver. An international lawyer and policy analyst, he has written extensively on human rights, international law, U.S. foreign policy, and humanitarian intervention. Tom, welcome back to Berkeley.
Wonderful being back, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and we moved when I was 6 or 7 up to New Hampshire, and I grew up in Manchester, New Hampshire, went to primary and secondary school there.
And how do you think your parents shaped your character, looking back?
Well, they certainly shaped my values. They weren't political people. They were never involved in political campaigns. But they came out of the world of, I would say, Jewish social democratic thought. They were classical 20th century liberals and great sympathizers with underdogs, and felt very badly about the treatment of blacks in this country. I think they were very representative of a strain of thought in the Jewish community, particularly in the urban and particularly the New York Jewish community in which they grew up. But they were definitely not political people, not movement kinds of people. But in their conversation, in the books that they read, but more important, I think what influences you about your parents is not what they say, but what they do. And I still remember living in St. Petersburg, Florida for a few months when I was 7. And my sister was just a year old, and we had what one used to call then a black girl, young black girl, who came back to the South, or to the South from the North. She'd never lived in the very rigidly segregated world of the South, happened to arrive at the same time we did, and she was looking after my sister part of the time. And my mother asked her to go down to a local store and buy something. It was the biggest store in St. Petersburg at the time, Webb's Drugstore. Mm-hmm. And she came back in tears, this young woman, because they wouldn't sell her, I think it was ice cream. She had to ask a white person to ask for the ice cream. Mm-hmm. And my mother, who's about 5 feet tall and actually quite a shy person, well, I can still picture her tugging on her hat and going off to the store and demanding, and I guess she came back and told me, she would demand to see the manager of the store, and went and told him what a horrible human being she thought he was. And apparently he said, well, this is the way it is down here, and I have nothing against blacks myself. It's not personal, but that's just the way things are. But the fact that someone so shy, because I think she was at heart shy, as I said before, would go off and do that. Well, it's what you do, not what you say. And so this sense of anger about injustice, about baseless discrimination, I guess that rubbed off.
And what about books? You said your parents read a lot. Any books that you remember reading when you were younger that set a similar kind of example, or any kind of example?
I read very indiscriminately, sort of picking books off their shelves. And some of them carried this same message of concern for injustice. But then I was also introduced to Flaubert. I picked off one of his least known works, Salammbô, which was an historical novel set in Carthage, and it had incredibly sexy sketches done by Rockwell Kent, I think. And I still remember this picture of the daughter of the great Carthaginian general, and she was nude, and very elegantly presented with a snake wrapped around her. And I think I was only about 10 years old then. And it was like an early awakening of sensuality and the sensuality of literature, really. So it was quite eclectic upbringing, I would say, unintentionally eclectic, because in many ways we were a very ordinary middle class family.
Were you active in clubs or in any athletics when you were young?
I tell you, my father had been a great athlete. He was, as a sophomore at City College, he played for Nat Holman, and he was their first All-American. I think he was second team All-American or something. And then he went on to dental school. And those days, you could go to dental school after 2 years of college, and he still retained his eligibility, so he played in the Ivy League, and he was leading the league in scoring when he had a fight with the coach because the coach thought he should concentrate on basketball, and he was trying to get through dental school. So I had this father who was a wonderful natural athlete, and I loved sports, but I wasn't a very good athlete then. I was the kind of guy, when they're choosing up sides after they've selected all the teams, say, oh, and Farrar, you're on that team. Well, I've gotten to be a better athlete as I've gotten older, maybe because my age group is deteriorating.
I see. I see. So you're come earlier in the line.
Well, I was saying to my wife the other day that I'm reliving my childhood and getting it right this time.
That's very good. That's very good. So you went off to Princeton to do your undergraduate work?
Yes, which was unusual because usually if you were reasonably successful in high school, I went to a public high school, a lot of my primary school classmates went off to private school, but I liked girls, and I didn't want to be in an all-male environment. Plus, that I'm not sure we could have afforded it very easily. And most people would then go to Dartmouth, or sometimes to Harvard, rarely to Yale. Almost no one in New Hampshire went to Princeton, which I think one reason I went. And also I went for some not such attractive reasons. Princeton had a lot of social glamour then. Perhaps among the Ivy League schools, it was the most glamorous socially. And Dick Kazmaier had just been an All-American there. And when you go down to Princeton, you've got this gorgeous neo-Gothic campus. And I didn't realize, I think I must have gone down in one of the few good days a year. That is when it's not either cold or raining. So anyway, I went down there, and I felt very much the way F. Scott Fitzgerald, I'm sure, felt. Except he came from a private school in Minnesota, and I think a relatively wealthy family. But I really felt like a provincial, and very undereducated and socially maladroit. So it wasn't, and in those days, Princeton really was a very conservative, socially.
And this would be in the 50s, or?
This was 53 to 57. And for instance, there was a great deal of open anti-Semitism at Princeton then. It wasn't, the administration wasn't anti-Semitic, but it didn't take any particular steps to try to dampen it. It was in the club system, which was autonomous, but not totally beyond the capacity of the administration to influence. It didn't create any social alternatives, for example. But it was a different era. And one of the things that's most extraordinary about the United States is that everyone who is not a person of color is now kind of lumped together in the category of part of the majority. I mean, in New Mexico, where I spent some time, as president of the university, there are only three categories of people in New Mexico. You're either an Anglo, an Hispanic, or a Native American. That's all there was. So that all the millimeters of ethnic distinction that existed when I was growing up, and Manchester, New Hampshire was a very ethnically self-conscious town. It had a Greek community and a German community.
So it was very diverse, even though it was
very diverse. Not in contemporary terms, because there were no African Americans there, no Asians, and no Hispanics. But this tells you something about the world of that time, that to be Italian rather than Greek, or Irish rather than French Canadian, or Jewish, or whatever, meant a lot. And although it was a much more relaxed environment in some ways than Princeton. I mean, discrimination I felt much more I felt it more keenly there. But I got a good education, and Princeton is, to be fair, Princeton has changed. The whole country has changed. After all, when I got out of law school in '61, there were still a lot of law firms that didn't take Jews. That's inconceivable
Yeah.
today. It doesn't exist. So the world has changed in a positive way in some respects, and U.S. society has changed in a very dramatic way in that period.
What about, did you have any mentors along the way, any courses at Princeton or elsewhere that really put you in the direction that you finally went, namely international law?
Not at Princeton, no. Although the historians there were outstanding. I always had a love of history, though. History, if I had a core course, that is a course that related to my deepest feelings, it was history. And Princeton had a very fine history department. But I didn't have a guru. The closest thing I had to a guru, actually, was a man much like myself, a Jewish fellow who was a generation older than I was, who grew up in Manchester and went to Harvard Law School, and he came back to Manchester. And later on, when I was deciding after law school whether to go back, because I was very interested in politics, and I could see the advantages of returning to my home base where I knew a great many people. I was a student politician, if I wanted to run for office eventually. And I asked him, well, how did you feel about coming back? And because he'd had a chance to practice in New York or Washington, Boston even. And he said, well, and he held many appointive positions in New Hampshire. And he said, well, if he were doing it again, he might practice in one of the great metropolitan centers. And I knew there were other ambitious guys going back to New Hampshire, and no one was going to guarantee that I'd be a senator or a congressman. It influenced me. But I didn't have a great guru, either in a vicarious one, someone who had written something, or a politician or something of that sort, or a personal one.
So why did you decide to become a lawyer, not a historian?
I didn't see myself as an intellectual, first of all. So therefore I didn't see myself as an academic. I thought of, to the extent I thought I had some gifts, I thought it was in debating, in expressing ideas in a way which made them accessible to ordinary people. And I thought of myself as identified with ordinary people. I liked sports. I was a sports fan. I was an ordinary kind of guy. But I thought that I perhaps was a little more introspective and had a sense of, I thought I had a sense of what made people function, what made them like things and dislike things. What I wouldn't have put it in these terms before, but people react to words. Words are symbols, and I thought I had some feeling for getting people to agree. I didn't see it as manipulation. I saw it as making people understand more clearly public issues, and that's why I thought of myself as having a political, legal career. And in this country, of course, the political careers tended to go with a legal career. So it seemed like a natural combination. And finally, what else was I good at? I didn't want to be a doctor. I wasn't interested in science. I wasn't any good at science. I wasn't an engineer. I couldn't sketch anything, so I didn't see myself as an architect, although I admired architects. What was left? Law. It was the default drive.
We can't discuss all of the many things that you've written, a number of articles. What is there a particular art to writing on public affairs and writing on legal affairs in a kind of clear and lucid way, which you do?
I think one of my advantages, if you're right, that I do write clearly, is I have not had a clear ideological position. And because I'm trained as a lawyer, not as a political scientist, I didn't fall clearly within some academic position in terms, it's almost a kind of ideology, are you a realist, are you an idealist, are you a liberal internationalist? So as I wrote about international relations, I wasn't constrained by a fixed intellectual or ideological position or point of view. I had to work it through my own mind. What what assumptions was I making? I always started with my viscera. A learned hand, the great judge, once said, a judge starts with a conviction that A or B should win, and then figures out why. That was his view. And I think Oliver Wendell Holmes had very much the same view. And in a way, that's how I have functioned in terms of public events. That I have a feeling what is the right move to make, what is the just, what is the practical, and then I try to figure out why I feel that way. So that involves going carefully through your own processes, sort of intuitive processes of ratiocination. And if you have actually had to work your way completely through an issue, including figuring out why you started off at a certain place, I think that helps you when you then put pen to paper, fingers to keyboard now, and to explain to others how to get there. You ask them to really follow the route that you've already followed. So if I were going to put my finger on something, I think the uncertainty, the ambivalences and complexity of my political position. I think many people think of me as a liberal, but I know that I have a lot of Burkean conservative elements in me too. I'm a kind of mix of, my wife would agree with this, I think, of conservative reactions and liberal reactions, using it in the 19th century sense of the libertarian John Stuart Mill view and the greater concern, anxiety about community and maintaining communities, and the importance of tradition in maintaining community, which is a Burkean perspective.
To what extent did a legal education help you in developing a rigorous way of looking at issues and materials?
That's an awfully good question, because in my case, and this, I'll relate this back to the question of writing and style, law training was very important to me. After I'd been through 3 years of law school, I happened to look at an old essay I'd written at Princeton, and it was sloppy. And the rhetoric, I'm sometimes accused of having somewhat overblown rhetoric in any event, but it was much worse then. And my years, particularly in the Harvard Law Review, where you were being edited word for word, sentence by sentence, and forced to compress, helped me an enormous amount. While many people claim that their writing styles were ruined by law school, I know mine was enhanced. And it was this demand for greater precision in every sentence as well as every paragraph, and the integration and synthesizing of your thought. That's law school played a considerable role there. It made me think in a much harder way about all issues.
When one looks at your work and what you've done, there is two roads diverge into a wood, so to speak, in the sense of getting involved in being an actor, getting into politics, taking on roles in the State Department, or as a legal advisor in Somalia, or as a member of a Human Rights Commission on the one hand, and just thinking and ideas on the other. Talk a little about that tension, that is having ideas and then applying them into the political arena, and why you really chose, one could say primarily, the academic life.
Yeah. Again, the absence of a very well-defined ideological position, which isn't all that unusual for Americans, but perhaps used to be more unusual for Europeans or Latin Americans, played a role here in the sense that some of my ideas were formed through experience, through practice. I've always wanted to be, I had a taste for direct involvement, for actually influencing the outcome of events. I'm most interested in the way people function, and I'm a little sorry that I haven't been able to write fiction, or at least try more. I have one novel and a draw, but every time I spend a little time trying to write fiction, I think this is frivolous and I probably can't do this very well. I better stick to the things I can do. I think I can do well. But it's an interest in human motivation and the observance of human beings, and well, that you do when you're in the field, as it were. When you're in the fort in Somalia in 1993, and events are occurring, history in a small way is being made, and it's being made by people reacting under pressure with many variables, some of them not very well understood. And observing this process and I've always been a little detached. I mean, I guess I have to take what I said first back. I wanted to be involved. I wanted to be a participant in life, not just in politics, but in life. I wanted to be a participant. But I've always been a little bit of an outsider, I suppose, but it hasn't been a searing experience to be outside. It's been a kind of curiosity. Like, I like to travel alone sometimes and sit in a restaurant in a foreign country and just watch people and figure out, even though I don't understand what they're saying sometimes, who they are, and what they're doing, what little dramas are occurring. And if I had just been an academic sitting in my office, well, all of that I would have been deprived of all of that experience. When I wrote a piece about humanitarian intervention after I came back from Somalia. I couldn't have written that piece.
Yeah. Where we should say you were a legal advisor to the UN
interventionary force,
yeah,
basically.
Right.
And I arrived when the war with Mohammed Farah Aidid broke out. And I went there, I'd been there 30 years earlier to train the Somali police force. And so I knew the country, and I sympathized with the country. With the people in the country. There wasn't any country when I went back. And I wanted to help reestablish the police and the justice system. That's what I went back for. And then the war broke out. And so I was asked by the Security Council, or asked by the Secretary General, to prepare a report to the Security Council on what had happened. And basically it was to draw up an indictment of Mohammed Farah Aidid. Well, means, motive, opportunity. When you're investigating a crime, that's what you look at. To look at motive, I had to get into the whole history of the UN operation there, and that led to views that this was probably an avoidable conflict. So I learned a lot about the dilemmas that face able people, because Boutros Ghali was an able man, and Admiral Howe, who was his representative, was an able man. I think they made mistakes, but I understood the difficulties of the choices. If I had just been watching this sitting back in the United States, I don't think I would have appreciated the difficulty of those choices, or even what the choices were.
So what does an international lawyer do?
Yeah. Well, students often ask me that, and they do a variety of things. First of all, international law is one way of looking at foreign policy, and it emphasizes the importance of understandings. You can call them rules, you can call them laws if you want to. You don't have to. You can just say they're understandings, principles, rules that get accepted by the participants. As in any game, there are always rules. They change over time, and sometimes unexpectedly, and sometimes they change through violations, which then everybody begins to accept. A new consensus forms. But so one of the things that international lawyers do is actually not international law. They're doing a lot of what I do, which is foreign policy analysis, but they bring to bear a sense of the enclosing structure of understandings, rules, norms, and so on. Then there's a very small group of people who actually litigate cases before international tribunals, World Court, arbitration tribunals. They make quite a good living out of that. That's a rather small group of people. And there are people who work for national governments. Every large country, even smaller ones, have legal advisors' offices, and there are careers to be made there. And that they're concerned with negotiating treaties and interpreting treaties and that sort of thing. Then there are careers in international organizations. There are some lawyers in each of the various international agencies. And finally, and most commonly, there is the private sector, and lawyers who, they're not really doing public international law. They're doing deals that cross national frontiers involving parties from different countries. And a lot of what people think of as doing international law is that's more comparative law than international law.
You wrote about international lawyers, and the two phrases that I picked up from a couple of your articles. and I presume this is the kind of international law you do, you say, practical moral philosophy is a peculiarly appropriate occupation for international lawyers. And elsewhere you said, what the lawyers have always offered when invited is specialized historical knowledge, knowledge about previous efforts expressed through formal rules and principles, institutions, and actions.
Oh, yes, I do remember that. Well, let's say you're trying to resolve an ethnic conflict. Well, a lawyer is, particularly a comparative constitutional lawyer, would be aware of all sorts of techniques that other countries have used or other actors have used to try to constitutionalize some arrangement, power arrangements, which reduce the anxieties of these competing groups. I mean, Switzerland is a case in point. You had four linguistic groups there, and they managed not only to coexist, but to prosper. And the Swiss Constitution is a quite complicated document which balances power. It's something less than the majority rule, and indeed in an ethnic conflict, a majority rule means the conflict goes on until the more powerful party wins. So if you're going to compromise a struggle for power, you've got to find some ways to, over a period, to constitutionalize an arrangement where even the minority gets represented and gets a piece of the action. All right, a constitutional lawyer is aware of the precedents and therefore is aware of a set of techniques which can be brought to the table and may be useful. Now, you could say, well, you don't have to be a lawyer to be aware of those. You could just be a student of a political scientist who's studied ethnic conflict. That's true. That's true. Lawyers just are, by their very nature, compelled to be aware of the different dispute settling mechanisms, particularly procedures. Lawyers are very procedurally oriented, and these procedures can be useful to deal with a whole array of conflict. So I would say lawyers are conflict resolvers and mitigators. They develop, they are trained in, they pick up along the way lots of techniques for reducing conflict. I think that's one of the more useful things they do.
Now, national laws are easier to understand, I think, for the average person because, you know, there's a district court or a state court, and that court has a force behind it so that it can implement its decisions. You know, people have consented to accepting what that court says. But international law is harder to get a handle on. You said that you think of international law as a system for coordinating voluntary action on behalf of shared interests.
Of course, you don't have a police, you don't have an international police force, and you don't have international bailiffs, and you don't even have a court with compulsory jurisdiction. It only gets cases if people want to bring the case to it. All right, so how do you have law, or how can you talk about law in that context? Well, I think of it this way. Suppose a group of people who work in a steel plant take over the plant in the sense that the plant goes bankrupt, and the owners of the plant sell out to the workers, including the foreman and some of these lower managers, and now it's their plant. All right, what do? Well, they have to develop some rules for running the place, otherwise they can't produce steel. So they sit down and they agree on who will do what and what things everyone has to do. So everyone has to show up at 9 o'clock and work until 5 o'clock, and there's overtime and whatever you'd expect to run a more or less efficient operation. You can go to the John as many times as you want, or maybe you can only go 3 times a day, whatever it is. All right, they reach an agreement. This is, to me, very much the way international law functions. Now, you could say, yeah, they reached an agreement because they had a common interest, which is in making the steel company profitable again. Sure, they had that common interest, but they also have some conflicting interests, don't they? Because some people might prefer to go on vacation a little more frequently, even outside the rules, so they figure, well, everybody else is working hard, so maybe I don't have to work quite so hard. How will you divide up all the money that you make? Will you divide it evenly, or will you give more to those who worked overtime? everybody wants as much as they can out of this deal. Yes, they have, so I'm saying they have common interests, but they also have cross-cutting interests. That's the international system. And that steel company will sometimes work, and it will work only if, in general, people accept the rules and, accept and act out the agreements that they have come to. Otherwise, the system will break down. And from time to time, you've had great wars which have been a sign of the breakdown of the agreement among states. That's the analogy I would draw. And the ultimate question about an illegal system is not how much power does it seem to have behind it. There are over 30,000 police in New York City, but there are burglaries. Indeed, there are only about 2% of burglaries ever get cleared up in New York. But the question is, to what extent do the participants in the legal system generally comply with the rules? If they do, I would call it a legal system. If they don't, I would call it anarchic. I would say that there isn't a sufficient consensus or community for law to function at that point.
With the end of the Cold War, where the work of international law could be said to have been distorted by the bipolar division, the ideological conflict, with that period over, and now we enter into this, we are in this post-Cold War world where globalization is such an important phenomenon. Do you think that the importance of international law will be more easily recognized and acted upon, or is there a tension there?
You could argue that to a large extent you had two systems of law functioning during the Cold War. There were the treaties and executive agreements that the Allies entered into. Like there were all the arrangements on all sorts of matters we had with the French and the Germans and the English and so on, and which most of us complied with. And most of it doesn't deal with war and peace. It deals with much more mundane things, like commerce on the sea, and where does your territorial sea extend to, and international aviation. It's all governed by international law, and that was even true in the Cold War period. People are always looking at the use of force. That's just a little piece of international law. That's the most problematical piece. But there's the day-to-day life of international commerce and the use of the sea and the use of the skies. That's regulated by law with almost full compliance. Now you've added new areas like the environmental agreements. I think that you're inevitably going to get, you can see that there are many more treaties. There are many more areas of life that are covered by international treaty. The more interdependence you have, the more you're like the steel plant, where you can't produce the steel without pretty consistent compliance by most people. And the collective interest is sufficiently strong, and the violations are sufficiently clear. That's one thing about the international legal system. If you violate, it's obvious. You can't do it secretly. You do it openly, because there's no other way to do it. And if you do it openly, consistently, then the system breaks down. But the greater interdependence, which we do have today, makes it more injurious to more countries to have the system break down. So I expect, more and more subjects to be covered by more and more elaborate rules, which are embedded in agreements, and a pretty high degree of compliance.
Now, what will be, do you think, the U.S. role in this shaping of more and more international regimes? Because throughout the Cold War, with the end of the Cold War, there is all of the cultural and historical baggage we bring, but also this manifestation of unilateralism, going it alone, not participating in agreements or not actually fulfilling the terms of agreements.
Yes. We think of ourselves as an enormously law-abiding people. But many foreign observers regard us as a little on the roguish side. that we use our power to carve out individual exceptions, or we refuse to participate in the treaty at all. So we refused, for example, recently to join the landmine treaty because of kind of marginal concerns about possible virtues of using landmines in one or two conflicts that we could envision. Every country is what it is for complex and deep historical reasons. So the first part of our national history, we were protected largely by geography, the luck of geography, from the threat of invasion. And we were able to live our national life without too much concern for what was going on in other countries. In the more recent phase of our national history, we have been the most powerful country in the world, and that has also enabled us to act as we deem appropriate, without too much reference to the preferences of other countries. Now, on the whole, I think we've been a relatively benign hegemonic state. But when you are clearly the most powerful state in military terms, in economic terms, in cultural terms, in terms of the cultural influences that you project abroad, there is a natural tendency to carve out exceptions for yourself, not even realizing fully that you are carving out, or you say you have particular responsibilities in the system. But the deeper point, the one I was making to start with, is that if you look at our history, we have a history of being a lone ranger in the world. Now, the objective fact is that there are a lot of issues out there that affect our interests, which we can't deal with through unilateral action. Environment is clearly one. I mean, what can we do unilaterally to prevent the Brazilians from destroying their rainforest, even though it has environmental implications for us? Nothing. So that's just one area where clearly we need to cooperate, to accept cooperative schemes in order to realize our national interests. But it's a little countercultural. It's a little hard for us to do that. And then our Constitution makes it harder for us. The fact that you need 2/3 plus one vote in the Senate to get a treaty approved, well, that complicates entering into treaties. Most countries have treaty ratification systems that are less onerous. So that is a problem for us. So we're living with this tension. We are the natural architects, as the most powerful country in the world, the natural architects of the rapidly expanding international legal system. And we are playing a role in that. But our ability to do so is definitely inhibited, definitely limited by this deep history of either unilateral action or sort of indifference to the opinions and preferences of other countries. So we're torn. And there are differences regional differences in the U.S. as well. And there are differences that relate to levels of education, but that's true of any country. I would say that I hope that we will become more cosmopolitan, because I think it's in our national interest to participate more fully in these developing systems. And without accepting the burdens of reciprocity, we're not going to be as effective architects of the international legal order.
Now, another phenomena that we're witnessing after Seattle and now in Washington is the extent to which there appears to be a populist or a reaction of citizens to the international legal evolution as it develops in things like the World Trade Organization. And what is being articulated is a sense of non-representation,
yes,
of the international forum not being a legitimate one for issues like securing environmental rights, securing worker rights, and so on. What do you make of that phenomena, and how will the international community respond to it?
You have an unusual coalition here. You have people of the right and people of the left who are hostile to international organizations like the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization is quite properly a focus of concern because its decisions, its activities do, I want to use a neutral, I was going to say intrude, that's not a neutral word, but let's say do affect everyday life, and just as the North American Free Trade Area affects everyday life, and will do so more in the future. It affects the decisions of state governments in fields like the environment and public health and safety, because decisions that states make in these fields can affect international trade. So I understand these concerns, and what precisely are these concerns, and to what extent do I sympathize with? Well, I don't sympathize with the window breakers in Seattle, but to what extent are there some legitimate concerns behind these manic and often irrational manifestations of concern? There is the question of to what extent does a country soften the impact on ordinary people of very rapid economic change, particularly where the overall change is positive in terms of increasing the gross national product, and it does appear that there's a direct causal relationship between increase in international trade and economic growth, from which most people benefit. But some people get hurt in the process. Their companies do migrate, their factories do migrate to lower wage areas. I think we should be generous to the people who get hurt in that process, because most of us are benefiting from that process, and we do it, but it has to be done at the national level. And there's nothing in the WTO, I think, that prevents that kind of generosity. So, but in a way, it's wrong to direct it at the WTO. It should be directed at state and national governments. And here we are cutting back on the security systems, welfare, and we're not doing too much in unemployment compensation. So some of let's say we're suspicious of state action to assist people who are having economic difficulties, but some of those difficulties are connected to the growth of international trade. So don't look at the WTO, but do look at the issue. Then the question of worker rights and environmental rights. There's some basis for concern here, because particularly in the environmental field, certain measures that you take to protect the living environment, for instance, the trade sanctions we took against Mexico because the Mexican fishermen were using nets which captured dolphins as well as, I guess, tuna. We said, well, we don't want you using those kinds of nets. We want you using other kinds of nets. So the Mexicans said, we'll use any kind of nets that work for our fishermen. Well, the Mexicans could argue in a case like that we were barring their goods from our markets, and that we had no right to bar their goods on environmental grounds. We could only retaliate if they had raised tariffs against us. So we had to look only at the narrow trade issue. Well, I think this is those who say, well, we'll accept less growth in the gross national product in order to use our influence as a country to protect the dolphins or other living species or do something else environmentally. They do run up against the rules of the international trade game. Now, those rules aren't irrational, because those rules are designed to deal with all of the ploys that countries use to inhibit the import of foreign goods in the name of doing something for the environment. So because it's not easy to enforce these rules, you try to get rather black and white rules, very, very bright line rules, which then may interfere with good faith efforts to use your authority to achieve objectives other than sheer growth in trade and GNP. Focusing on labor rights, here again, on the one hand, you want to protect, you sympathize with workers in poor countries, but on the other hand, one of the main advantages that these countries have is low wage rates. And what I would be in favor of is restrictions, is the ability to prevent countries, or efforts to prevent countries from, what many countries do is they don't allow labor unions to function. They interfere with freedom of association. And if we think of worker rights in terms of the right to organize locally, that is within countries, to try to improve their position in the economic game, I think those rights should be protected. And in theory, they are protected through the International Labor Organization, but often they are violated. There are many inhibitions on labor union organizational activity. So if labor rights focuses only on the right of association, I think there's something to be said for incorporating that into trade agreements. Although, as I say, you can get at it from the human rights side. You don't have to get at it through the international trade side. But if you're trying to fix minimum wages internationally, the result may be that you inhibit the development of poorer countries. So I'm torn on that. I'm torn, but in the end, because the data indicates that the single most important reducer of poverty is growth, even if it's in countries which don't have very good means for distributing growth equitably. Growth itself, in fast growth countries, poverty gets, absolute poverty, not relative, but absolute poverty does get reduced. And therefore, my inclination is to promote growth through trade, feeling that as long as at the same time freedom of association is protected, that the working classes in each country will gradually improve their position.
Going back to your adjectives with regard to an international lawyer, the practical moral philosopher, and a person with specialized historical knowledge. I would like to discuss your experience doing human rights work in Latin America. And we don't have a lot of time, but what shall we draw from that experience in terms of the evolution of and dispersion of international human rights norms in those countries during that period, and what that might tell us about problems that we see down the road, for example, human rights in China? Are the two cases entirely different, or might some of what you learn there inform us about how we should deal with those problems in the future in a place like China?
Well, I'm not sure that my experience as a lawyer, is so important as my sense of what can be done. I'm a pragmatist, and I'm not sure that law made me a pragmatist. I think you're a pragmatist on the basis of your early upbringing, your character, your whole life experience. For me, the issue is what will improve the condition of real people in a real place at a given moment in history. If you want to apply that to China, there are two positions you could take. One is that the Chinese are violating human rights in varying ways, that your function as academic, as writer, as someone concerned about human rights is to condemn, is to use all the levers of power in an effort to change their behavior. I look at China and I ask myself, where are human rights in China today compared to what they were in 1979 when Deng Xiaoping consolidated his position and consolidated the new policy of openness? Well, I haven't spent all that much time in China, but I certainly have spent time with people who know China from 1979 to the present. And there's nothing to dispute here. The degree of individual freedom and well-being that the average Chinese person experiences in the year 2000 is incomparably greater than 1979. And it's not a perfect straight line, but it's moving upward all the time. the policy of openness has worked. It's worked for the Chinese, it's true, it's worked for the Chinese elite. Maybe the pressures on them would be even greater if they were not growing, had not been growing at a rate between 6 and 11% a year during this period. I mean, that once you lose your ideological legitimacy, and I don't know if anyone has ideological legitimacy anymore, I don't think Marxism gives you much ideological legitimacy. You don't have electoral legitimacy. What do you have going for you? Success. And they've been pretty successful, or at least they've been there. So I look at it and I say, I don't want to fix that machine. It ain't broken. It's working. I don't have an absolutist position. I approach all human rights cases that way. No, but there is a place for the other kind of person. I'm trying to build bridges to China. At my school, I've established a Center for China-U.S. Cooperation, and we have visiting scholars, and we have students, and we go to China, and we have workshops with state institutions. And I see this as an important way of linking our societies. But does that mean that it's improper for people who belong to a human rights organization to gather the facts? No. And which activity you're attracted to is very much a function of chance and personality. But the role that I've been attracted to in the Chinese case is constructive engagement. Now, however, in the Guatemalan case, thinking back to the 1980s, or the South African case, I was dead opposed to, quote, constructive engagement, because I felt that pressure could succeed in improving the conditions of people there. So this may reflect less my law than my sense of history and my absence of a strong ideological orientation. Of course, a postmodernist would say, I'm kidding myself. Of course I have a strong ideological orientation, I just don't know it. But be that as it may, this is the way I think about issues. And I think, you come back to your original question about my family and their role on me. My family were my parents were very unideological people. They weren't intellectuals. They were educated, but they weren't intellectuals. They reacted to injustice as they saw it. And I always hated bullies, maybe because I wasn't big enough to be one, I don't know. And I react to injustice as I see it, and I want to do something about it. And to the extent I haven't been just an academic, it's because as an academic you send your words out into cyberspace, you don't know if it has any consequences. What I discovered as a member of the Human Rights Commission is that under some circumstances, exposure can have consequences. But it very much depends on the structure of the society. In the country I was deeply involved in, Argentina, during the period of state terror, what I discovered, what I realized was that the military government could not have functioned as the military government any more than the military government in Chile could have without the support of a certain sector of society. Maybe it's only 25 or 30%, but it's a significant sector. And that many of the people in that sector, at least in the Argentine case, truly didn't want to believe that a campaign of extermination was being carried out. They knew repression was being done, but they felt it was necessary, and because they really were two rather large subversive movements. But they didn't want to believe that a campaign of extermination was going on. When the commission wrote its report and presented it, 360 pages with tremendous detail, they knew. And so people of goodwill, who thought of themselves as honorable, withdrew their moral support from the government, and it began to unravel as a consequence. But in Guatemala, the military didn't care about international opinion, and it only articulated with a very small part of society and what is called the oligarchy, because they really are an oligarchy, and they didn't care about the methods that were being employed. In fact, they were helping to finance some of the paramilitary, and Salvador was a case in point. So there, exposure had no effect internally, because the people who were being brutalized knew they were being brutalized, and the people who were supporting the brutalization favored it and knew it was going on. So different instruments work in different circumstances, and they require judgment, which can sometimes be wrong. And I've tried in my life to try to understand each case, and even to try to understand the perspectives of the torturers. And I actually once wrote a small article which began as a speech in which I gave the best case I could for torture. I pretended to be a Latin American colonel, actually. In the end, I wasn't persuaded, but I made the best case I could.
So one is left with a sense of the pragmatism, the subtlety, the drawing on different bases of knowledge of political science, law, history, and so on that you've applied as you have done the work of international law. So I have one final question, and that is, as students watch this tape or read it on the web, how would you suggest, what would your advice be to them in preparing for their own future? What should they study? How should they prepare?
I'm perhaps old-fashioned in thinking that history is the keystone subject. History and literature. I would say study history and literature. I would study literature to imagine other ways of visualizing almost anything, human relationships, society, because in reading the novel you kind of check your own visceral reactions. Well, here's someone, the great novelists create another world for you, but the same moral problems, and they have characters reacting, and you kind of check, it's a check on your own instinctive understanding of a situation. It's a very important check. In the case of history, you get a sense of the complexity, but not I don't use some people use complexity as a shield from feeling or from acting. They say, well, life is so complicated, the Balkans are so complicated, there's nothing you can do there, they just kill each other all the time. Well, first of all, you find out that it's not true, that much of what is presented to you as history by ideologues or even by the press in good faith turns out to be such an encapsulation of history that turns out not to be the real history. So it makes you aware of the complexity and makes you want to understand the complexity of situations, but not to the point where you can't act. And if I had the test, I think, of any human being, and people should be aware of this, is to appreciate that knowledge is partial and that you could be wrong in acting yourself or in recommending action to others, including your own government. You could be wrong. But can you act knowing that you could be wrong? Mm-hmm. Some people act on the assumption they're always right, and they are monsters, I think. But some people are paralyzed because of the awareness of the complexity of things. And the great test is whether you can act on the basis of your best sense of what the case is. But keep thinking after you have acted. In the case of Vietnam, we committed ourselves, and then even when people like McNamara believed that they were wrong, they couldn't withdraw, and it's partially psychological, I think. You'd committed other people's lives and so on. But to be fully human, I think you have to accept the consequences of having made the wrong decision and try to mitigate its consequences.
Tom, thank you very much for joining us for this journey back in time to talk about your life and your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.